So recently, Wizards of the Coast and D&D Beyond announced One DND, a name that I will never not flub, the next stage in D&D 5th Edition's evolution. It takes the form of a new PHB coming in 2024, with regular playtest materials put out on D&D Beyond in the meantime. So far, we have the first document, centered on character origins. Some of it seems good, some bad, some is basically the same, but all of it is, again, playtest material, so it is subject to change. Regardless of my specific opinions on individual changes, which I'll get to later, there is a fundamental problem I have with the structure and presentation of One DND. D&D 5e has problems. That shouldn't be a controversial statement, nothing is perfect after all, and I think these problems are fixable, but it would take a D&D 5.5e or 6e to do so. This is because ultimately you cannot fix problems with the system purely additively. If you add new content on top of what already exists to try and cover up the underlying holes, then those holes still exist. You need to get rid of the problematic content first to replace it with better content. So that brings us to the fundamental issue of One DND, in my opinion. It is explicitly compatible with all currently existing content. Everything already published is part of One DND. This is not 5.5e or 6e, it's just new content for 5e that's in line with current design philosophies at Wizards of the Coast. But the old content, the stuff that this book is trying to revise and update, is still valid to use. And the underlying mechanics of 5e, which some of them do have issues, are too ingrained to just patch over. This isn't a new problem. When 5e was first released, players found the Ranger, especially the Beastmaster subclass, to be underwhelming. WotC released the UA Revised Ranger as a playtest of an improvement to the Ranger class. Ultimately, however, it was stated that there would only be one Ranger class, the PHB Ranger. This makes sense, it would simply be confusing to have two officially published Ranger classes. But the consequence of this is that all of the changes and improvements that could have been made to that Ranger class were never actually fully made. So when I look at this UA and I see a new human, a new Tiefling, a new design ethos for feats hinted at, I wonder how the issues of the old content still existing will impact 5e moving forward. And I worry that eventually this will become unsustainable at worst and just a confusing mess at best. And the underlying problems of 5e will still exist in some form. This brings us to the more specific changes, which I am less overall negative on. First off, there are two major changes to the races of this UA document. The first is that now none of them give ability score improvements. That is the realm of backgrounds, a change that I think is somewhat meaningless ultimately, since it's not like a PC can have one but lack the other. In, for example, Pathfinder 2e, every stage of character creation offers ASIs. Race, background, and even class. The options PF2e players can choose from each of these parts of character creation are partially limited by the particular character option, but still remain somewhat flexible. Meanwhile, One DND shifting ASIs from race to background feels more like an aesthetic change. Ultimately, every character gets the same ASI options, which are the Tasha's options. I guess now you just can't accuse WotC of being eugenicists, I suppose. The second major change is that, with the bizarre exception of Dragonborn, no race has an inherent language. You pick two languages and no common. This gives a nice little bit of flexibility to players instead of every elf knowing Elven, even if, say, they were abandoned at birth and raised by goblins. I really don't know why Dragonborn all know Draconic though, it's just weird by comparison. Beyond this, the races presented in the UA document are mostly the same as the first PHB. A few of them can now be small size category, a change that I think is perfectly fine. It gives players a new option that they can use to make their character a bit different. Humanoid half-races have been erased as a mechanical designation. If your character is half-elven, then you choose which of your parent races you draw your mechanical features from, and then can use physical traits from both to describe your character's appearance. Age is an average of both parental races. This consequently means that orcs are upgraded to PHB race status to replace the missing half-orc. The orc presented here is largely the same as presented in books such as Volo's Guide, though now they have the half-orc Relentless Endurance. Half-orcs and half-elves from the Player's Handbook 1 are still valid character choices, though, which I would honestly prefer to see them get rid of them if they're moving towards this, but obviously they can't because that material is still valid. There are a few specific changes that I think are very noteworthy though. Humans now get automatic inspiration when finishing a long rest, and all of them get a first level feat, defaulting to the skilled feat, but you can change if you wish, which does make them stand out a little bit more than just what they were before, where you get a +1 in everything, or you can limit how many +1s you get and choose a feat. It also means that you don't have the problem of human and variant human. It's more unified. Dwarves can now give themselves 60-foot tremor sense for 10 minutes a few times per day, which makes sense for underground dwellers, and it gives them an interesting new dungeon delving tool. Ardlings are the new special boy race for this UA, and they're basically animal-themed Aasimar. Their flight ability is underwhelming in comparison to the Protector Aasimaras and other flying races, and it kind of just amounts to a bonus action dash that ignores terrain. Beyond that, they get a few spells, similar to other races. But to round out the segment on the new races, I have to give... Tieflings now come in 3 flavors. Infernal, which is the PHB 1 Tiefling, Abyssal, and Chthonic. Each lineage gets its own list of physical traits you can pick from to make your Chunibyoji OC, as well as a different spread of low-level spells and a resistance. But this means that there are now 16 unique subtypes of Tiefling in D&D 5e. There are also 4 identical versions of the PHB Tiefling in published material under slightly different names, and there are 2 different options called Abyssal Tieflings that have totally different mechanics. Tieflings are a mess. And I want to clarify something. I don't think any of the revisions of Tieflings are, in isolation, bad. There's just way too many, from the Player's Handbook to Sword Coast Adventurer's Guide to Mordenkainen's and now this UA. And this new UA pairing it all down to Infernal, Chthonic, and Abyssal is, I think, a good way of representing the spread of lower planes that is in line with how, say, Aasimar are presented, and without going overboard. A 5.5e or 6e would be the perfect chance to clean house and get rid of the messier parts of 5e's evolution, such as the various different types of tieflings. Instead, One DND is just throwing more stuff onto the pile, and the individual quality of each one gets lost among the noise. I mean, seriously, how many people even remember that there's a winged tiefling option? Moving on, we now go to... This is an area that I think is an across-the-board improvement. You get your ASI here, either 3 +1s or a +2 and +1. No +3 in 1 stat though, because what's your cowards? There's now greater standardization across backgrounds, from the number of proficiencies they grant to the gold value of gear that they offer. This is to make customizing your own specific background easier, which leads to the final big change. Previously, backgrounds all gave their own special feature. Now, I actually asked my D&D group if they could remember the background features of our party members, and they struggled to even remember their own off the top of their heads. Background features are just too niche. They don't come up enough to be impactful in my experience, and it makes it harder for players to create their own background rather than use a pre-made one, because you need to get DM approval for whatever ability or work with your DM to create a specific ability. Now, each background gives you a first level feat. You pick from the list, you get that feat. And the first level feats, well... Overall, I think they're not that exciting. The UA only has 10. Most of them are relatively unchanged from the PHB. Healer gets a rework to make it more appealing to, well, healers. Tavern Brawler gets a tiny buff, but a few have been nerfed. Notably, it has been stated that no first level feats offer partial ASIs anymore. I wouldn't mind this in theory, but a lot of the feats I think are perfect for the background slot, such as Chef, do offer partial ASIs. This is, in my opinion, a problem inherent with the linking of ASIs from leveling with feats. A lot of feats, especially the feats for skills such as Chef, are a major part of making a flavorful part of the character have a mechanical benefit, which reinforces that yes, your PC is actually really talented at this thing beyond a normal person. But the benefits of many feats are simply not as powerful as a +2 in 1 stat, or +1 in 2 stats, which is often used to round out both to a higher modifier. Thus, to soften the blow of a full ASI of being sacrificed, these feats in the past have offered a partial ASI. If level 1 feats are going to have no ASIs attached, then that means that feats perfect for that slot will be locked out, or else people taking those feats at levels above first will have to give up their ASI entirely instead of just partially. Or they use the older version of the feat. If feats are being significantly reworked, I think they need to be disconnected from ASIs entirely, much like in older editions, and be given at separate stages of leveling. To finish off the overview, there are a few more rules changes I think need some discussion. It should be noted that many of the rules changes presented in the document are based on commonly observed house rules, or clearing up game elements players have expressed uncertainty about online and through sage advice. Inspiration now comes on every natural 20 on a D20 test, in addition to being providable by the musician feat and humans' inherent daily inspiration, as well as the regular DM fiat. I think this is an interesting way of giving inspiration a greater level of presence in the system, instead of it just being up to the DM, except the Holophant in the room is why inspiration has such a limited presence. Personally, I feel that people don't think about it that much because advantage is just so easy to come by that inspiration can become useless quickly. Inspiration is also now lost when starting a long rest, which leads me to point out, per the long rest rules in the UA, your long rest is now completely cancelled if you participate in any amount of combat. Previously, a full hour of strenuous activity, including combat, would be necessary, but now a single round of combat ends the whole long rest, as well as an hour of strenuous activity like walking. This can have some serious consequences, where if you roll random encounters during the player's long rest, a single combat encounter can screw up the whole tempo of the adventure. Possibly the biggest change, however, is the D20 test rules changes. First off, I want to state, the statement that a nat 20 always succeeds and a nat 1 always fails is not really actually a change. It's a clarification. With a few tiny exceptions, this rule was always in effect. The reason is simply because you should only be calling for rolls when the outcome of a player's action cannot be clearly determined by mere judgment. If a barbarian can smash open a wooden door even on a roll of a 1, then the outcome was not ambiguous at all, and you shouldn't have asked for a roll. If the bard is unable to seduce the big bad evil guy on a nat 20, then you shouldn't have asked for a roll. Though it can be dramatic or hilarious to tell a player that they fail even with the maximum roll just to make a point. But in that case, the roll is just theatre, you're not actually making a skill check. As a note, I believe the rogue's reliable talent completely bypasses this rule, since that ability treats the die roll as a 10, regardless of what the die itself said. The only situation in which you should actually call for a roll, even when a nat 1 can still succeed or a nat 20 can still fail, is opposed checks, and this is purely because the target number is undetermined until after the roll is made. So you can't use your judgment to say, well, you're definitely going to succeed on the DC. The DC doesn't exist yet. Overall, though, I don't think this change to rolling 1s and 20s is that impactful. However, what is a big change is the changes to crit rules. Now, crits only happen when a player rolls a 20 on a weapon or unarmed strike attack roll. For DMs, it has been stated that recharge abilities are intended to serve as a replacement for crits, being a big hit which has an element of randomness in when it can occur. I think that aspect of the change is fine. That said, of the 2,830 monsters from WotC in 5th edition, only 521 have recharge abilities, as far as I'm aware. If recharges are actually going to serve as a replacement for Dungeon Master crits, we're going to need a lot more. As a note, I find it somewhat funny that Crawford gave an example of DM crits being potentially too devastating, especially at low levels, with something I have actually experienced. The first time I DM'd 5e with the original starter set, a critical hit from a bugbear took the cleric from full health to dead in one blow. So I can understand wanting to take this level of randomness in damage dealing away from DMs. What I feel is a much worse change is how crits actually work though. Firstly, spell attack rolls are now locked out of crits entirely. The stated reason for this is to make crits a thing that martials do, to give them something more unique. In theory, giving a more unique feature to martials isn't a bad thing, but where this notion becomes significantly worse is with the secondary change. Critical hits now only double weapon or unarmed strike dice. Additional dice are unaffected. No more will rogue sneak attack dice, paladin smites, various buff spells and so on affect a critical hit's damage. This obviously means that the actual impact of a martial's critical hit has been severely reduced. The most frustrating part is that if the intent was to make martial crits special, there was a simple way to do so. Countless homebrewers and many other systems have already done it. Add special effects when critting with a weapon, knocking enemies prone, disorienting them to give them debuffs, puncturing through one enemy to hit another. Any number of effects could be added to make critical hits from martials more interesting and impactful. Instead, martials get a nerf, and spellcasters are already largely insulated from the changes since spells with saves already don't get crits. To end on a slightly more positive note, the various spells gaining the super types of Arcane, Divine, and Primal, and those lists being used for feats such as Magic Initiate rather than specific classes is good. It makes feats such as Magic Initiate and presumably also Ritual Caster more beneficial because you have a wider spread of spells to choose from when you take those feats. Now we just need the Martial super type back and we can really get going. So yeah, that's about my opinion on the One DND pitch. I'm interested to see what changes they bring in future, and I'm definitely going to be giving a lot of feedback, but yeah, ultimately my main concern is that the issues I have with 5e are going to go unaddressed because they can't be addressed without publishing a new edition.